The riverbank gave way without warning, a wall of churned brown water tearing through the ravine faster than Aveline could outrun it, and she scrambled up the nearest slope with her heart hammering, only to freeze at the sight waiting for her at the top. A nest, enormous and half-flooded, sat wedged into a hollow in the rock face, and inside it, 3 hatchlings, no larger than hunting dogs, shrieked in panic as rising water crept toward the ledge that was all that kept them from being swept away entirely. She did not think. She had spent 6 years studying wild dragons from careful, respectful distances precisely because she understood how dangerous it was to do otherwise, and every instinct trained into her screamed to retreat and find the parent before approaching hatchlings alone. But the water was rising fast, and the hatchlings were shrieking, and Aveline had never once in her life been able to watch something small and frightened drown without trying to stop it. She waded into the flooded hollow and began lifting hatchlings, one by one, onto the highest dry outcropping she could find. The third hatchling, weaker than the others and shivering with a cold that had nothing to do with courage, would not stop crying even once she had it safely out of the water, and Aveline, working on instinct rather than any training that covered this particular emergency, pulled dried fish from her own field pack and offered it directly, murmuring low, steady reassurance, the way she once soothed injured foxes on her family's land. The hatchling ate ravenously, and its siblings crowded close, and Aveline spent the next 20 minutes feeding 3 panicked, starving hatchlings with everything her pack contained, entirely unaware of the massive shadow that had just fallen silently over the ravine behind her. I should say plainly here that Aveline had heard the stories, same as everyone in the border settlements, about the guardian dragon that had claimed this stretch of unmapped mountain and permitted no rider, no ranger, no living soul near its nest in the 3 years since it had first been sighted. She had come to study its nesting patterns from what she believed was a perfectly safe distance. She had not planned on ending up chest deep in its flooded nest, hand-feeding its hatchlings, when she finally turned and found the guardian itself watching her with an unreadable, storm-gray stare. Aveline was 27, the daughter of a border ranger who had spent his entire career protecting wild dragon territories from the poaching networks that hunted eggs and scale for the black market's 3 kingdoms south, and she had grown up learning dragon behavior the way other children learned their letters, patient and careful, at her father's side. He had died 8 years earlier defending an unregistered nest from armed poachers who outnumbered him 4 to 1, and Aveline had spent every year since trying to finish the work he had given his life protecting, cataloging wild nesting grounds so quietly and so carefully that no poacher network would ever trace her research back to the animals themselves. She stood frozen now in the flooded hollow, one hand still extended with the last scrap of dried fish, staring up at a guardian dragon the size of a small hill, and waited for the violence every settlement story insisted was coming. It did not come. The dragon, whom she would later learn was named Vane, simply watched her with those storm-gray eyes, taking in the 3 hatchlings clustered contentedly around her, fed and warm and no longer crying, and something in his rigid, protective posture eased by a degree Aveline could not have explained if she tried. "I did not mean to trespass," she said aloud, her voice steadier than she felt, backing slowly toward the edge of the nest with her empty hands raised. "The flood came up faster than I expected, and your hatchlings were going to drown, and I could not just watch that happen from the ridge." Vane's great head lowered, slow and deliberate, until it hovered directly above her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath. And Aveline held very still, certain this was the moment 8 years of careful research ended, in exactly the way her father's had. Instead, Vane exhaled a long, low breath across her shoulders, and turned his attention back to his hatchlings, nudging each one gently with his snout as though counting them, and Aveline understood, with a disbelief that made her knees go weak, that she had somehow, impossibly, just been permitted to leave. She climbed back down out of the ravine on legs that would not quite stop shaking, replaying the whole impossible encounter over and over as she went. The storm-gray eyes, the total absence of the violence every settlement story had promised, the strange, wordless understanding that had passed between her and a creature large enough to end her life without effort. She had spent 6 years believing she understood wild dragon behavior as well as any researcher in the border territories. She understood, walking away from that flooded nest, that she had just witnessed something no study had ever prepared her to explain. She did not get far. A man stepped out from behind a boulder at the base of the ravine before she had gone 50 feet, tall and weathered, a hunting bow half raised in a grip that told her plainly he knew exactly how to use it. His eyes narrowed with a suspicion that felt, to Aveline, considerably more dangerous than the dragon she had just left behind. "You have 3 seconds to explain what you were doing in that nest," he said, low and hard, "before I decide you are exactly what you look like." "And what do I look like?" Aveline shot back, adrenaline from the flood and the dragon both still hammering through her, leaving little patience for a stranger's accusations. "I look like someone who just pulled 3 hatchlings out of a flash flood, while the Guardian's actual protector was apparently somewhere else entirely." The man's jaw tightened at the accusation, something flickering behind his guarded expression that might have been guilt, though he covered it quickly with the same hard suspicion he had greeted her with. "I am Fenwick," he said, lowering the bow only slightly. "I watch this territory. Poacher scouts have been spotted in the region twice this season, testing the perimeter, and a stranger appearing in the Guardian's nest the same week is not a coincidence I am inclined to trust without explanation." Aveline felt something cold settle in her stomach at the mention of poachers, old grief rising sharp and immediate at a threat she had spent 8 years fighting in her own quiet way. "My name is Aveline," she told him, matching his hard tone with one of her own. "My father was a border ranger who died defending a nest from poachers, exactly like the ones you just described. I have spent 8 years cataloging wild territories precisely so networks like that cannot find them first. If you actually watch this territory as closely as you claim, you should already know poachers are not the ones who just spent 20 minutes hand-feeding a flood-terrified hatchling." Fenwick studied her for a long, weighing moment, something in his expression shifting slowly from suspicion toward a far more complicated uncertainty. "I lost my own mentor to that same kind of network," he said finally, low, the hard edge in his voice softening by a fraction he did not seem entirely comfortable revealing. "I do not extend trust easily out here, Aveline. I have watched what happens when I extend it to the wrong person." Aveline held his gaze steadily, understanding the particular caution grief could carve into a person better than most. "I am not asking for easy trust," she told him. "I am asking you to watch what I actually do before you decide what I am." Fenwick did not fully lower his guard, but he walked her back up to the nest himself, watching with open disbelief, as Vane permitted her within arm's reach of the hatchlings, a second time, and without so much as a warning growl. "He has never let anyone near this nest," Fenwick said quietly, and Aveline heard, beneath the careful control of his voice, genuine astonishment. "Not rangers, not scouts, not anyone I have brought up here in 3 years trying to earn enough trust to properly protect this territory. You waded into flooded water and fed his hatchlings, and he let you simply walk away afterward. Maybe he understood I was not a threat," Aveline said, kneeling to check the weakest hatchling's breathing, professional instinct overriding her lingering wariness of the man watching her. "Animals usually know the difference between someone who wants to help and someone who wants to take, if you give them the chance to show you." Fenwick's expression, watching her work, softened by degrees she suspected he was not fully aware of showing. He explained, over the following hour, the delicate, exhausting work of protecting an unregistered clutch from a poaching network that had already tried twice this season to locate it, moving supplies and shelter under cover of night, disguising every trail he made to and from the nest, living a life of careful, isolated vigilance that had clearly worn at him in ways he did not openly admit. Aveline recognized the particular exhaustion in his voice, having watched the same weariness settle over her own father in his final years, and found herself, despite every reasonable caution, wanting to ease it. "Let me help," she said, surprising them both with the offer. "I know these territories better than most rangers in this region. I know how poacher networks move and think, because I have spent 8 years studying exactly that to keep animals like these safe from them. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, weighing a trust he had apparently not offered easily to anyone in 3 isolated years, before finally, slowly, nodding. "You will follow my lead on anything involving the nest itself," he added, some of his guarded authority returning even as he extended the offer. "And you will tell me the moment you notice anything even slightly out of place in this territory, no matter how small it seems." Aveline nodded her agreement without hesitation, recognizing in his careful conditions not distrust, but the exacting discipline of someone who had kept a fragile secret alive, alone, for 3 difficult years. The following weeks settled into a careful, unexpected partnership, Aveline and Fenwick working together to monitor the nest and the surrounding territory for any sign of the poacher scouts he had spotted earlier in the season, and Aveline found herself, despite every instinct telling her not to trust so quickly, growing steadily more comfortable in his guarded, watchful company. Vane, too, softened toward her, with each passing week, allowing her closer to the hatchlings than any creature outside Fenwick himself, until she found herself spending whole afternoons simply sitting among the small, increasingly playful brood, while their enormous guardian dozed nearby. She noticed things, working alongside Fenwick day after day, that did not fit the plain picture of an isolated hermit ranger, a signet ring, half hidden in the lining of his travel coat, bearing a crest she recognized from imperial correspondence her father had once shown her. A familiarity with palace patrol schedules that no border ranger should have memorized so precisely. The particular unconscious authority in the way he gave instructions, expecting them followed without argument, that belonged to someone considerably more accustomed to command than his plain, weathered clothing suggested. "You are not simply a ranger," she said to him one evening, watching the fire rather than his face, giving him room to answer honestly, without the pressure of her direct gaze. Fenwick went very still across the small camp, and for a long moment, Aveline thought he might simply deny it and end the fragile trust they had spent weeks building. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the particular exhale of a man setting down a weight he had carried alone for too long. "No," he admitted quietly, "I am not simply a ranger. I have not lied to you about the nest, or the poachers, or anything that actually matters to keeping these hatchlings safe. But I have not told you everything about why I am the one out here guarding them personally, instead of delegating the work to someone with considerably less to lose if it goes wrong." Aveline turned to look at him fully then, searching his face for the truth he was still visibly deciding how much of to give her. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "I have trusted you with 3 weeks of my time, and considerably more of my caution than I extend to most people. I would rather have the whole truth now, than discover it later, at a moment neither of us gets to choose." Fenwick studied her for a long, weighing silence, the fire crackling between them, before something in his shoulders finally, visibly relaxed, as though he had been waiting, without quite admitting it to himself, for exactly this kind of invitation. The decision was taken out of both their hands 3 nights later, when Vane's low, warning growl woke them both well past midnight, the dragon's massive head raised and turned toward the tree line, with an alertness that made Aveline's blood run cold before she had even fully processed the danger. Fenwick was on his feet instantly, bow already in hand, and together they moved to the edge of the camp to find 3 figures moving through the trees with the deliberate, practiced stealth of people who had done this kind of scouting before. "Poachers?" Fenwick breathed, low and grim, and Aveline felt 8 years of careful, controlled grief rise sharp and immediate at the confirmation. They watched the scouts test the perimeter for nearly an hour, clearly mapping the terrain rather than attempting an attack yet, and Aveline recognized, with a cold, clinical detachment she had trained herself to maintain for exactly this kind of threat, the particular pattern of a larger raid being prepared, rather than a single opportunistic strike. She recognized, too, the specific markings on one scout's equipment, a stylized brand she had cataloged years earlier in her father's old field notes, belonging to a network that had operated along this exact border for over a decade, without ever once being fully dismantled by Imperial forces. Her hands trembled slightly as she pointed it out to Fenwick, old grief and fresh fear tangling together at the sight of a symbol she had hoped never to encounter directly in her own lifetime. "They will come back with more," she said quietly, once the scouts had finally retreated deeper into the mountains. "This is exactly the pattern that killed my father. Scouts testing defenses for weeks before the network commits to a full raid. We have days, maybe a week, before they return in force." Fenwick's jaw tightened, and Aveline watched him make some private, difficult calculation before he finally spoke again. "I need to send word to the capital," he said. "I have resources I have not yet used, because using them means revealing exactly who I am, and I was not certain, until tonight, that the danger justified the risk of that exposure." Aveline watched him wrestle visibly with the decision, understanding, without needing further explanation, exactly how much it must have cost a man who had spent 3 years hiding behind a false name to consider abandoning that protection now. "Whatever those resources are," she said quietly, "I trust that you know this territory and this threat better than I do. I only ask that whatever you decide it because it protects the nest, and not because you are afraid of what I will think of you once I know the truth." Aveline felt her heart climb into her throat at the admission, understanding, finally, the shape of the secret he had been carrying since the night they met. "Then send the word," she told him, steady, despite the fear humming through her chest. "Whatever you are hiding, Fenwick, I would rather lose the comfort of not knowing than lose this nest to the same network that already took my father from me." "My name is Cormac," he said, once the message had been dispatched by a hidden signal only his most trusted riders would recognize, the truth arriving in the quiet hour before dawn, with none of the ceremony such a revelation should probably have carried. "I am emperor of this territory, and I have been guarding this nest personally for 3 years, because it is the last unregistered clutch in the region that the poaching network has not yet located, and because the network responsible for hunting it is the same one that killed your father, and dozens of rangers besides him, over the past decade." Aveline felt the ground shift beneath a decade of careful, private research, suddenly finding an official name and face. The specific brand she had recognized in the tree line, matching precisely the network Cormac now described in grim, exhaustive detail, complete with the shifting names and territories they had used to evade capture for so many years. She listened to all of it with the particular stillness of someone finally being handed the full shape of a grief she had only ever known in fragments. Aveline absorbed the revelation with a stillness that surprised even herself. 8 years of grief and purpose suddenly, terribly, converging on a truth she had never expected to find, guarding a dragon's nest in disguise. "You could have sent soldiers," she said finally. "An emperor does not need to personally hide in the mountains for 3 years to protect one nest." Cormac's expression carried a weariness that went considerably deeper than 3 years of isolation alone could explain. "Soldiers can be bribed. Soldiers can be followed back to a location they were meant to keep secret," he said. "I lost an entire garrison to exactly that failure 4 years ago. An inside informant who sold a nest's location to the same network for enough coin to retire on. I decided, after that, that the only person I could fully trust with this particular secret was myself." Aveline felt the weight of that decision settle over her, understanding, in a way few people could, the particular loneliness of protecting something precious entirely alone. A loneliness she recognized because her own father had carried an almost identical weight through the final years of his life, without ever once asking anyone to share it. "You are not alone in it anymore," she told him, quiet and certain, reaching for his hand in the pale pre-dawn light. "Whatever comes when that network returns, you have someone standing beside you now who has spent 8 years training for exactly this fight." Cormac's fingers tightened around hers, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything more, the weight of shared purpose settling into something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of more than partnership. He told her, in the hours that followed, of the 4 riders he still trusted absolutely from a garrison otherwise compromised, men and women who had served him personally since before his coronation, and who would recognize his hidden signal without needing further explanation. Aveline listened to the careful, methodical way he planned their defense, matching his precision against her own years of studying poacher tactics, and found the partnership settling between them into something considerably steadier than the wary standoff of their first meeting 3 weeks earlier. The poacher network returned 5 nights later, a dozen armed raiders emerging from the tree line with weapons drawn, and a confidence that told Aveline they believed the nest entirely undefended, and the battle that followed was fast, brutal, and entirely unlike anything either of them had trained for alone. Vane met the first wave of raiders with furious, protective violence, wings scattering 3 attackers before they came within 20 feet of the nest, while Cormac fought with a trained, disciplined precision that finally, fully revealed the soldier beneath 3 years of ranger's disguise. Aveline fought beside them both, every hour of her father's careful training finding its purpose in a single devastating night, and when one raider recognized Cormac mid-fight, shouting his true title in stunned realization, the remaining poacher's confidence shattered entirely, understanding too late exactly what force had actually been guarding this nest all along. The battle turned decisively in their favor within minutes, Vane's fury and Cormac's trained command breaking the raid's coordination completely, and the surviving poachers fled into the mountains with 3 of their own left captured and bound in the trampled camp. Aveline knelt afterward beside the smallest hatchling, checking it for injury with hands that would not quite stop shaking now that the danger had passed, and found Cormac kneeling beside her a moment later, blood and exhaustion etched into every line of his face, watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the battle they had just survived. "You fought like someone who has been waiting 8 years for exactly this chance," he said quietly, and Aveline felt the accuracy of the observation land somewhere deep in her chest. "I have," she admitted, her voice breaking for the first time since the fight began. "I have spent 8 years training for a night I never actually thought would come, and tonight it came, and my father's death finally means something more than a story I tell myself to keep going." Cormac pulled her into his arms without hesitation, and Aveline let herself, for the first time in 8 long years, simply grieve and celebrate in the same overwhelming breath. The 4 riders Cormac had trusted with his signal arrived at dawn, securing the captured poachers and beginning the careful work of tending the wounded, and Aveline watched them treat Cormac with an easy, practiced deference that confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, the truth of everything he had told her. She found she did not resent the revelation the way some distant part of her had feared she might. She found, instead, that she simply wanted to keep standing exactly where she was, beside him, for as long as he would let her. The captured raiders, questioned in the days that followed, gave up enough of the network's structure to finally identify the leadership responsible for a decade of poaching raids across the border territories, including, Cormac confirmed with a grim satisfaction that mirrored Aveline's own, the specific commander who had ordered the raid that killed her father 8 years earlier. Imperial forces moved on the network's remaining strongholds within the week, dismantling in a matter of days an operation that had evaded capture for the entirety of Aveline's adult life. She stood in the nest clearing the morning the news reached them, watching Vane's hatchlings tumble over each other in the kind of carefree play they had never quite managed under the shadow of an unresolved threat, and felt something in her chest finally, fully unclench after 8 years of carrying her father's unfinished fight as her own. "It's over," she said, mostly to herself, disbelief coloring every word. 8 years of carried grief, finally settling into something she could set down, instead of carry forward alone. The network that killed him is actually, finally over. I have read a line from the writer George Eliot, asking what we live for, if not to make life less difficult for one another, and I think of Aveline wading into that flooded nest without a moment's hesitation, and of Cormac spending 3 isolated years guarding a secret nest with nothing to gain from it but the animal's survival. Neither of them had set out looking for justice or for love. They had simply refused to let something helpless drown, and found, in that refusal, both. Vane approached her slowly as she stood in the clearing, lowering his great head to rest against her shoulder in a gesture she had come to recognize, over the past weeks, as his particular way of offering comfort, and Aveline leaned into the warmth of it, finally allowing herself to fully feel the weight of an ending she had spent 8 years afraid to hope for. She thought of her father then, more clearly than she had allowed herself to in years, not the grief of his final ambush, but the steady, patient way he had taught her to kneel beside frightened animals and wait for trust to arrive on its own schedule, rather than forcing it. She understood, standing in that clearing with Vane's warmth against her shoulder, that every lesson he had ever given her had led, however circuitously, to exactly this moment, and she found the thought settled her grief into something closer to gratitude than sorrow, for the first time in 8 long years. Cormac found her there an hour later, the last of the Imperial riders having departed with the captured raiders in tow, and crossed the clearing with none of the careful, guarded distance Fenwick the ranger had once maintained between them. "I have spent 3 years protecting this nest alone because I did not trust anyone else enough to share the burden," he told her, taking both her hands in his. "I do not want to protect it alone anymore. I do not think I could, even if I tried, after watching you wade into flooded water for hatchlings that were not yours to save." "They were not yours either, if we are being precise about it," Aveline said, a smile breaking through despite the weight of the last week's grief and violence, and Cormac laughed, low and warm, some of the exhaustion finally lifting from his face. "No," he agreed, "but I think Vane made his own decision about that a long time before either of us caught up to it. I think, watching the two of you together, he decided you belonged to this nest the same afternoon you fed his hatchlings during a flood you had no obligation to wade into." Cormac drew her closer, resting his forehead against hers in the quiet, hard-won peace of the clearing. "I love you," he said, simple and unguarded in a way 3 years of careful disguise had never once allowed him to be with anyone. "I loved you before I told you my name, watching you argue with a stranger in the woods, rather than back down from a threat you did not yet understand. I do not want to spend one more season guarding this nest, or my own heart, without you standing beside me for both." Aveline felt 8 years of solitary purpose finally settle into something shared, something whole, and drew him into a kiss that carried the full weight of grief resolved, and love freely chosen in the same breathless moment. Vane curled around them both as the hatchlings tumbled playfully nearby, and Aveline thought, standing in the nest that had somehow become the center of her entire new life, that her father would have understood, better than anyone, exactly what she had finally found guarding the very thing he had given his life protecting. The hatchlings, grown bolder with each passing week, tumbled around their feet as though eager to claim their own share of the moment, and Vane huffed what might have been amusement at the sight of his small, unruly brood weaving between the 2 humans he had decided, long before either of them caught up to the truth of it, belonged together in this nest for good, a certainty neither of them had needed a single spoken word to finally understand. Standing together in the clearing that had once been a stranger's guarded secret, and had somehow, improbably, become the truest home either of them had ever known, hard-won and freely chosen, and entirely, finally, theirs, in a mountain hollow that would never again know the particular loneliness either of them had once carried into it alone, only the quiet, ordinary joy of a family, finally, fully, and permanently assembled.